Thank you for coming. And today's lecture is generously sponsored by the Russian Department Fund and is meticulously organized by our tireless administrators, Katie Sanger-Jackson, who just left, and Bert, Rose Payne, and me, nephew. Thank you guys very much for putting the time and love into organizing this lovely event. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce our speaker and my former student, Margaret Samu. In 2001, Margaret graduated from Wellesley College as a Davis Scholar, and then she went on to earn her PhD at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. Margaret works on art and design of the Russian Empire in a global context. Based in New York City, Margaret teaches at Parsons School of Design and also lectures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her work has been published in the Art Bulletin, Искусствознание, Bibliofika, 19th Century Studies and Experiment, as well as a volume she co-edited From Realism to the Silver Age, published by Northern Illinois University Press in 2014. Margaret recently finished a book manuscript titled Russian Venus, the female nude in art and culture of the imperial era. She has received numerous grants, I'm not going to list all of them, and she also serves on the organizing committee of the 19V Working Group on Russian Culture, Literature, and the Arts. So, in addition to this very formal introduction, if I may add a few words, actually in Margaret's own words, about how she first developed an interest in Slavic studies. I think that would be educational and inspirational for our students. This is Margaret's own words from an interview for Association for Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. So this is Margaret speaking. I was interested in Russia long before I even heard of SEE studies. I studied ballet from the age of 7 and danced professionally into my mid-20s. During that time, we had increasing contact with the Russian ballet world, which piqued my interest in Russian culture. Eventually, I had Russian teachers and colleagues who were working in the same artistic tradition that I had learned. It felt like we were speaking the same language with different accents. Later, at Wellesley, I majored in art history and French. I already felt drawn to the 19th century because of my ballet background. So, when I took a course on 19th century Russian literature in translation, something clicked into place. In ballet, I had been virtually living in the intersection of 19th century French and Russian culture. Now, I could explore it intellectually. I studied Russian language intensively before starting graduate school in art history at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, where many professors encouraged me to write papers on Russian aspect of whatever course I was taking, portraiture, art criticism, etc. So today, Margaret is back at her alma mater with a lecture titled Slavic Folklore, Supernatural Women, and the Ukrainian Other in 19th Century Russian Culture.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I was telling Ellen Wovna that when I was told that this room would be Founders 120, that this was the place where I gave my first talk at the Roman Conference. It was an early Roman conference, and I was right there. So it was nice to be back in so many ways. And I want to thank the art department and of course the Russian department for hosting me. It's really, and for hosting this event. I'm really pleased to be back. So I will get started. By far, the most popular painting shown in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1879 was Konstantin Makovsky's Rusalki, which we see here. The painting depicts over 24 female figures from Slavic folklore in a moonlit landscape. In the foreground, the nude figures play in the water, while further back, they hold hands and dance up into the clouds. An onion-domed church in the background locates the scene in the Russian Empire. Trees and greenery surround the pale bodies, which are barely covered by their flowing tresses, all bathed in the moonlight as mist rises from the water. On a canvas nearly 12 feet wide, the scene of supernatural ecstasy upstaged every other painting on view, attracting huge crowds in Russia's capital cities. For both its size and the attention it attracted, reviewers called Makovsky's enormous painting the centerpiece of the exhibition. Rusalka images by Makovsky and other artists brought together ideas from East and West in a way that seems paradoxical to us today. In Western Europe, artists have historically considered the female nude to be the pinnacle of artistic achievement, a symbol of beauty, an emblem of art itself. In the Renaissance, artists like Titian depicted the female form to measure themselves against the ancients. By the early 19th century, artists such as Ingres no longer used a narrative pretext like Venus for these images, and the female nude became its own genre. Throughout this history, as the nude became a test for artists, viewers also used these images to demonstrate their connoisseurship. The genre of the female nude emerged as a way of judging and possessing beauty. Now, the Rusalka was a distinctly Slavic genre, a subject. To clarify, Rusalka is the singular form, while Rusalki, ending in I, is the plural. So Rusalki might resemble European water nymphs or mermaids, but they were different. By depicting Rusalki, then, Russian artists could appropriate the prestige of nude subjects from European art while depicting them in the guise of national subject matter. Makovsky's work on his painting exemplifies this paradox. He traveled to Paris, where professional models were readily available, and also to Ukraine for the setting. Looking at this and other depictions of Rusalki by Petersburg-based artists from the later 19th century, I started to wonder, why did they so often associate Rusalki with Ukraine? So today I'll focus on depictions from Rusalki in Europe, in Russian culture, first in folklore, then Romantic era theater, literature, and the visual arts. Next, we'll look at paintings from the 1870s, Makovsky included, to consider how Rusalka images related to stereotypes about Ukraine and Ukrainians in the Russian imperial center. We'll see that the Rusalka theme allowed artists to prove their fluency in the Western European visual idiom of the female nude. They transported the nude into a local context as a Slavic spirit, while placing her outside of Russia, in Ukraine. By examining these works, we'll understand how they brought together the visual mastery of women's bodies and possession of national culture. So if you've heard the word Rusalka before, it's probably from the opera by Antonin Dvorak, which premiered in Prague in 1901. This was decades after the works that we'll be examining today. In the opera, it's the name of a specific character, here portrayed by Renee Fleming, but in Slavic folklore, Rusalka is the generic name for a type of water spirit, similar to a European water nymph or an ancient Greek siren. According to folk beliefs, Rusalki dwelt at the pond, lake, or river where a maiden's unnatural death occurred, especially a suicide of a woman pregnant before marriage. People saw them alone or in groups, swinging from tree branches, singing, dancing, and combing their unbound hair, which was sometimes reported as green. Accounts from most regions noted their preternatural beauty, their marvelous voices, and sometimes their unusually large breasts. Rusalki lured men to their deaths by playful seduction, caressing, and tickling before drowning them, less out of malice than out of mischievous teasing that mortals could not withstand. According to both legend and eyewitness accounts, Rusalki wore transparent white drapery, but usually appeared unclothed. And here we have a map of Rusalka sightings. It's kind of like UFO sightings, but with supernatural figures. In the mid to late 19th century, folklorists documented accounts of Rusalki as far west as present-day Poland and Bulgaria, in Belarus and Ukraine, and across European Russia. There was some regional specificity, including different names in different languages and slight subtle variations on what exactly they did. But despite this wide geographic range, in 19th century Russian urban culture, Rusalki came to be closely associated with Ukraine. tales of Rusalki moved from folklore to elite forms of cultural production in the early 19th century. And here we have two important contributors, the writers Alexander Pushkin and Nikolai Gogol. The multifaceted Rusalka, playing, dancing, singing, seducing, killing, appealed to them and to other artists who sought national material for their work. Between 1800 and 1860, writers and composers produced dozens of variations on the theme, including poetry and prose, theatrical dramas and musical compositions, from art songs to staged operas. To give you a sense of how popular the theme was, Pushkin alone wrote 3 texts on the Rusalka. The earliest Russian staging of a Rusalka dates to 1803. It was a sensationally popular comic opera titled The Dnipro Rusalka, Dniprovskaya Rusalka, which premiered here at the Great Stone Theater in St. Petersburg, which we're looking at across the canal. The opera had catchy tunes and thrilling over-the-top special effects that captured the imagination of audiences in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. This first production had inspired 3 spin-off productions that continued to draw huge audiences into the mid-19th century. These comic operas were truly foundational for popularizing the Rusalka theme. Now, the Dnipro Rusalka was not an entirely original work. It was, in fact, an adaptation of the Viennese comic opera, a Singspiele, from about a decade earlier, the 1790s, titled The Danube Maiden, which was based on Germanic folklore. Before strict copyright enforcement, it was absolutely customary to simply translate a libretto, adapt some elements to local culture, add a few songs to the original score, and then you had, voila, a Russian comic opera. And here we have the opening pages from one of the spin-offs. This is the first spin-off of the Russian adaptation called Lesta the Dnipro Rusalka. And it was the translator and the librettist, Nikolai Krasnopolsky, he's the one who reinvented the Danube Maiden for Russian audiences, and he's the one who should be credited with moving the story from the Danube to the Dnipro, and for making the Central European water nymph into a Slavic Rusalka. He could have moved it to Russia's major river, the Volga, or to an unnamed pond or lake in the countryside, but his libretto specifies a forest on the banks of the Dnipro. So why did Krasnopolsky choose the Dnipro? His choice tells us a great deal about attitudes in the imperial center towards colonized parts of the empire, and assumptions about national history and geographical borders. The libretto of the Austrian operetta says that it's based on, quote, a legend from the distant past. Adapting the story for a Russian audience, Krasnopolsky chose to set it in Kievan Rus, a state that existed from the 9th to 13th centuries. The human characters had medieval-sounding names, so he really played up the medieval historicizing aspects as much as he could. Now, looking at a map of ancient Kievan Rus, we see that the Dnipro served as its main waterway, and you can see it kind of running down here. Right, it goes through Kiev, right, the capital, and it also other principalities of ancient Kievan Rus had their main cities on the Dnipro and its tributaries. In short, it was a very important river. The river most associated with Russia, by contrast, the Volga, right, is way over here, right, up there, and it ends up over here. So it starts in the kind of lighter red region up there. See it, right? It's written here, Volga, in blue, way above my finger, right? But it doesn't turn into the mighty Volga that we associate with Russia until much farther east. That part of Russia, that land to the east of the red part, became part of Russia only in the 16th century. It was under Ivan the Terrible, so much later. So in short, if Krasnopolsky wanted a body of water that people would associate with as part of the Russian Empire, but connected with a distant past, it had to be the Dnipro, right? That it was the obvious choice. And he might not have been thinking about politics, but his choice of the Dnipro was based on the idea that Kievan Rus stood at the foundation of Imperial Russian history. This fit into a larger imperialist narrative that began in the 18th century and became increasingly prevalent in the 19th. serving as part of a justification for subordinating Ukraine. Krasnopolsky's decision would have lasting effects, as many writers, musicians, and audiences followed his lead in locating Rusalki on the Dnipro or elsewhere in an imagined Ukraine. So the first artists, painters, and sculptors who depicted the Rusalka found inspiration from the authors Pushkin and Gogol, whom we saw earlier. This happened in the early 1840s, when artists such as Fyodor Moller were studying abroad in Rome. In this painting, he depicted a naked Rusalka sitting on a rock in the forest with her feet dangling in the water. As she raises her arms to groom her coppery hair, her body twists towards the monk in the background, providing a frontal view of her entire torso. She locks eyes with the astonished man with a slight smile on her face. According to sources from the period, Moller based his Rusalka on Pushkin's first Rusalka poem written in 1819. The ballad tells of a hermit monk who lives in the woods. After seeing a Rusalka by the pond, he can no longer concentrate on his prayers. In the end, he disappears into the water, apparently drowned by the Rusalka. Moller captures the humor and innuendo of Pushkin's ballad, which is kind of, well, it's funny. It's not exactly racy, but it's definitely funny. And he conveys the devout monk's helplessness in the face of the sensuous beauty's teasing. So here we see a print, a xylograph after Moller's Rusalka. It made the painting accessible to a wider audience beyond St. Petersburg, and some details are a little bit more visible, I think. So there are two things I'd like to note about Pushkin's ballad that are relevant to Moller's work. First, it's not set on the Dnipro. It's located somewhere on an unnamed lake in an unspecified forest. Second, Pushkin describes the Russian as nude, nagaya, noting her pale white body and voluptuous beauty that captivate the monk. This meant that his Rusalka character, that is Pushkin's Rusalka character, could readily be translated in the visual arts into an undraped female figure, similar to a Venus, this prestigious subject the artists used to compete with one another. The second Rusalka from the 1840s was this sculpture by Pyotr Stavasev, and here we see two different views of the same one. Stavasev first conceived the project as a group of Rusalki on the Dnipro River, meaning that he must have been looking either to the comic opera for inspiration or to a later work by Pushkin that features a whole band of Rusalki. When producing the figure group became too complicated for Stavasev, he decided to focus on only one of the figures and destroyed his clay sketch of the whole group. And as a result of this change, his work also became associated with Pushkin's ballad, the same one that Moller used about the monk. Now, Stavasev's stay in Rome overlapped with Moller's in 1841-42, so he almost certainly knew the painter's Rusalka, at least by reputation. It made quite a stir. And when we compare them, we can see many similarities. Even though they're in completely different media, right? Both works depict a nude female figure with water at her feet, grooming her hair, and smiling mysteriously. While Moller set his painting in a thick forest, Stavasev used a tree stump to suggest a sylvan setting. Both artists depicted the Rusalka perched on a high seat, elevating her hips to allow full visual access to her naked body, which recalls Pushkin's text and also the folklore sources that talk about the figures. For young artists studying in Italy, depicting the female nude was virtually a rite of passage. They had easier access to professional models and greater freedom from the constraints of the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, where they had all studied. Especially for artists from countries on the periphery of major European artistic centers like Russia, Britain, and the United States, paintings and sculptures with nude figures, especially female figures, were associated with Italy and France. So here we have, just as other examples, we have a Susanna and Bathsheba by painters from St. Petersburg who were in Rome in the decade before Moller and Stavasev. And seen together, they show that the Rusalka we just saw were essentially variations on a theme. They were formulaic depictions of women's bodies that allowed artists to compete on the same terms while displaying a bit of inventiveness. The nudes that these and other Petersburg artists produced in Italy signaled to patrons back home that they had spent time abroad. In Russia, the cachet of Europe was the cachet of Europe was vital for helping painters and sculptors to compete in an art market that continued to favor foreigners. Depicting the female nude played a key role in cultivating a cosmopolitan image that would boost their reputation back home. So in Europe, the female nude signified competing with great artists of the past, in a long tradition of visual mastery of women's bodies. In Russia, the nude took on an additional meaning. It signified Europe. Most artists coming from Russia chose conventional European themes for their nudes. Among the most popular were biblical subjects like Susanna, Bathsheba, like we see here, as well as mythological subjects such as Venus at her bath or Diana and Actium. Mollev's and Stavasier's Rusalki are nearly indistinguishable from these European-style nudes. There are no markers of place or national dress that locate them in Slavic lands. The only iconography that sets apart the Rusalka is her grooming her long hair and her predatory gaze. And even that's a little bit hard to detect. She just looks like she's smiling. Otherwise, female figures depicted outdoors near water could be almost any other bather. For these artists, producing a nude was the most important task, and highlighting nationality was secondary. So while some critics associated Mollev's and Stavasier's Rusalki with Pushkin's ballad, neither work was perceived as Ukrainian, and indeed the ballad did not identify a location. But these Rusalki from the 1840s came on the cusp of broader shifts about national subjects in the arts. In the mid-19th century, the educated classes started to look to people of the provinces for an authentic connection with true Russianness. Folklore was becoming a subject of scientific study, and as it became more empirical, geographical specificity was more important. So now let's see how these developments played out in the 1870s. Nearly 3 decades after Mollev and Stavasier, Ivan Kramskoy made a painting of Rusalki, which we see here. In a verdant landscape lit by an unseen moon, 22 female figures gather at the edge of a pond and along a path into the distance. Behind them rise 2 forested hills, one with a thatched roof house, a typical Ukrainian chata. Kramskoy's original title announced his source, the novella May Night, published in 1831 by Nikolai Gogol, who was born in Ukraine and worked as a writer in St. Petersburg and in Rome. The Rusalka scene in Gogol's text is a very short episode in which a young Cossack named Levko dreams that he's put to a test amid a group of ethereal maidens by a pond. Kramskoy based his work on the vernacular-style Ukrainian tale by Gogol instead of Pushkin's lyrical verses, and this made a difference in the way he depicted them. He produced a noticeably more earthbound painting. Instead of the Rusalki appear in the protagonist's dream, but his painting is just sort of more part of the earth. Kramskoy's painting is also grounded in the new ideas of local authenticity that emerged in the second half of the century. The intervening decades between the 1840s and 1871 had seen a lot of changes in the Russian art world. Kramskoy had become a leader in the emergent realist movement and a founding member of the Kreditvishniki. This was a group that organized traveling art exhibitions that were independent of the Imperial Academy of Arts and other state institutions. And what we're looking at here is a catalog of these traveling art exhibitions that he was responsible for. Realist artists like Kramskoy rejected a conventional academic subject matter. Mythological nudes such as Venuses, nymphs, and bacchantes became a special target for scorn. Kramskoy may have depicted Rusalki to demonstrate how to remake supernatural subjects for a Russian audience in realistic style. His approach shows how much had changed since the earlier Rusalki depictions. Mollev and Stavasier had emphasized the figure over the setting without trying to evoke a specific locale. But Kramskoy focused instead on the story's ambiance, which meant that he needed to study the right setting. So he traveled to Ukraine, where he worked at the Stroganov family estate in Hotin. This was on the very northeastern edge of Ukraine, in order to capture the local landscape and the lighting. His letters show that his reading of Gogol shaped his perception of the place. Despite being literally just across the border from from Russia into Ukraine, he was like the first rail station right after, right into Ukraine. He marveled at this distinctively different atmosphere that he felt. In letters to a friend, he described the impression of moonlit nights as fantastical. He said they were astonishing, and he claimed that he expected to see phantoms. These are quotes from his letter. And by imbibing this magical ambiance, he hoped to convey Gogol's repeated evocations of the incomparable Ukrainian sky. Trying to merge a naturalistic depiction with the supernatural atmosphere of Gogol's tale became Kramskoy's greatest challenge. Writing to his friend, he described himself as trying to catch the moon. Now, just as Kramskoy worked hard to capture a credible setting, he depicted the Rusalki as real terrestrial women with corporeal mass and volume. They wear white shifts, as Gogol described, but they're not the transparent maidens flitting weightlessly around the bank that we read about in the novella. They stand and sit, motionless, hands clasped, gazing into the distance. Only a few of the Rusalki appear nude or partially bare to the waist, their bodies blurred in the distance or else obscured by reeds or water. The artist's preparatory studies here show that he worked mainly from models wearing white shifts. Sometimes they had one shoulder exposed or they were bare to the waist. Only one of them that I've seen was fully undressed. These modeling sessions are his only recorded work from undraped female models that I've been able to find. They indicate, I think, the importance of the Rusalki's bodily exposure to his conception of the subject. Yet because Kramskoy's painting is small, it's less than a meter in height, these tiny figures barely register as individuals. This Rusalki painting includes just enough nudity to acknowledge folklore sources and Gogol's tale, which is admittedly ambiguous on the subject of the women's bodies, but it's not enough nudity to draw attention. So instead of highlighting the maidens' bodies, as Moller and Stavasier had done, Kramskoy focused on the landscape. He attempted to summon Gogol's dreamlike atmosphere using light alone, without resorting to effects of fog and mist. His figures practically merge with the land and water. They're bathed in moonlight that unites the scene. Reviewers praised his emphasis on the setting and his choice of a classic tale of Ukrainian folk life for lending the painting a believably regional feeling. Interestingly, as much as Kramskoy sought to convey a supernatural ambiance, his incentive to travel to Ukraine arose from a new drive for local authenticity among the new generation of artists. The field of ethnography was now taking shape, and it was popularized in this huge ethnographic exhibition held in Moscow in 1867. And what we're looking at here is a photograph of the setup. It included huts and these mannequins in sort of real-life kind of poses, playing their balalaika and doing other things that evoke folk life. So from the mid to late 19th century, educated enthusiasts across Europe moved from gathering folklore out of a romantic interest in national spirit to studying these materials as a scientific pursuit. In Russia, they founded an imperial society dedicated to studying the natural sciences, anthropology, and ethnography, and this was the group that organized the exhibition. Their goal here was to increase interest in folk life of the Russian Empire, as well as to promote nationalism and pan-Slavism. The exhibition presented all Slavic peoples as united under the banner of a hegemonic Russian language and culture. The terms that are used in this period are telling. Russia, what we call Russia today, was called Great Russia, Velika Rossiya, to distinguish it from Ukraine and other places. Ukraine particularly was called Little Russia, Mala Rossiya. The exhibition drew thousands of visitors. Its factual, empirical method mirrored the Kramskoy's naturalistic approach to painting and his advocacy for a national school of art. Now, Kramskoy had several reasons for traveling to Ukraine to work on his painting, but I believe that one was to capture the magical atmosphere of Gogol's sky. Right? His dedication to local authenticity must have convinced this realist painter that he could do so only on Ukrainian land. As an advocate for a national school of painting, he avoided anything that could be mistaken for a European subject. Kramskoy's notion that rural Ukrainian lands manifested a special ambiance, lacking in modern Europeanized Russia, cannot be separated from the political status of Ukraine at the time. The mid-19th century was a period of territorial and cultural expansion for the Russian Empire. This is precisely when Russian historians developed the imperialist narrative that Ukrainian and Russian peoples shared a common, unifying cultural and historical inheritance. Russians had come to regard Ukraine as a primordial Russia, a kind of Ur-Russian homeland. And its geographical adjacency and Slavic heritage made it familiar, yet its distance from the imperial capital gave Russian travelers a sense of going back to a simpler era of their own past, when folklore and superstitions held greater sway. To urban Russians, Ukrainian peasants appeared to be primitive, slightly exotic cousins of their own common people. So Ukrainians were both us, nashi, and other, chuzhia. Right? So even if Rusalki existed in Russian culture, in Ukraine they seemed more likely to appear, at least for Russians. They seemed like very much just under the surface of Ukrainian landscapes. Now, Kramskoy was an ardent supporter of national themes and art, as I said, but we don't see him going around spouting this kind of imperialist ideology. And yet his descriptions of Khoisin, where he was staying, indicate that even he had absorbed Russian stereotypes of Ukraine and its land. Returning to Makovsky's Rusalki from just a few years later, we can see how different it is from Kramskoy's. Painted on a monumental scale, it fully justifies Makovsky's reputation for painterly panache and brilliant lighting effects. Makovsky had been a founding member of the Peredvizhniki, but had left the group after 2 years in order to make his career at the Paris Salon. He was never a realist painter, and indeed his Rusalki epitomized his ambitions for dazzling displays of bravura effects that earned him success at international exhibitions. The old watermill in the background signals to viewers that Makovsky drew on Pushkin rather than Gogol. He chose Pushkin's late unfinished drama, The Miller, instead of the lyric ballad that had inspired Morev and Sabasev that we saw earlier. The drama that Pushkin wrote was a high art version of the comic opera Rusalka from 1803. Remember, that was the one that first located Rusalki on the river Dnipro. So this was the story of a miller's daughter. She was seduced and betrayed by a nobleman then she drowned herself in the river and joined a band of Rusalki, taking revenge on him. So unlike Pushkin's poem with its one lone Rusalka, these works for the stage featured a large group of Rusalki, in which Makovsky's painting, they become dozens of naked figures. Viewers immediately recognized the artist's source, and several critics quoted from Pushkin in their reviews. Now, like Kramskoy, Makovsky traveled to Ukraine while painting his Rusalki, and he went actually here. We know where he went, to the estate of Kachanivka, which was then owned by Vasil Tarnovsky. It stood on the Smosh River. It was not the Dnipro, but still, it was good enough. He was in Ukraine. Now, Tarnovsky was an interesting person. He was a major collector of Cossack and Hetman objects from the period before Ukraine's imperial domination by Russia. He became something of an impresario, or a promoter, hosting artists who sought inspiration in local material culture. So by going to Kachanivka, Makovsky went to the very heart of Ukrainian national culture. And yet, despite going to that trouble, his preconceived notions about Ukraine overrode what he really saw on the estate. For instance, here is the Church of St. George that Makovsky would have seen on the estate. Its columns, arches, and hemispherical domes recall other neoclassical churches that were built across Europe and Western Russia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The style represented the taste of Europeanized elite Ukrainians, but it did not suit Russians' image of rural Ukrainian culture. So Makovsky replaced it with an onion-domed church that viewers would have associated with the medieval past. He had originally planned to exhibit his canvas in France, where such exotic architecture would have appeared kind of orientalist. It would have offered an exotic flair to Parisians. So Makovsky's Rusalki brought together folklore, favorite Russian author, and an authentic landscape. He may have chosen a similar subject to Kramskoy, but he took full advantage of the potential for nudity that Kramskoy had downplayed, an approach sure to win the attention of viewers. For a sense of how different the paintings are, this is a comparison of their scale, approximate. Kramskoy is a modest genre scene with a tiny earthbound figures that you can hardly make out in the scale. Makovsky's is a giant supernatural extravaganza. Kramskoy's was purchased by Pavel Tretyakov for his growing collection of Russian realist paintings in Moscow, so it would have been seen in that company, or Makovsky's was acquired by the Tsar for the Imperial Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Literature on these two paintings tends to emphasize their many differences in approach, intention, and their reception. And rightly so. They're very different. But I want to focus on one parallel, namely that both artists traveled to Ukraine to prepare their paintings, and their location became part of the painting's fabric. They were part of the narrative that was told and publicized about them. Of course, this choice shows their desire to connect their paintings to their literary source material from Pushkin and Gogol. Still, I think there's something more to consider. Ethnographers tell us that cultural groups define their identity in opposition to other cultures. And I believe that the choice to locate these supernatural women in Ukraine rather than the Russian countryside is significant. In the late 19th century, Russians used Ukrainian culture both as a source of their own cultural history as Orthodox Christians and also in opposition to define Russian cultural identity as distinct from modern Ukraine. Rusalki are part of Slavic folklore, part of a shared Russian-Slavic historical identity, but we see this tendency to displace them to Ukraine, close to Russia, but still different, other. And this is clearly related to ethnic stereotypes of the Russian Empire that portrayed Ukrainians as a simple and backwards people. This notion becomes visible in the Rusalka, who's depicted as a wild creature, a figment of primitive imaginations in the Ukrainian landscape. The feminine and the primitive collapse into one another. These negative stereotypes of Ukraine helped to define Russian cultural identity as civilized by comparison. All this should be seen on the backdrop of the Ukrainian national movement that was surging in the 1860s and 1870s. And here we see a leader of that movement, Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet, as well as a painter and printmaker in his own right. This period of anti-Russian agitation in Ukraine led to repressive measures from the imperial capital. The Russian state forbade Ukrainian cultural expression, banning publications, theater performances, and songs about Ukraine. And also any works published or sung or written in Ukrainian language. They even denied the existence of Ukrainian as a distinct language. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that these paintings are ideologically motivated, that Kramskoy and Makovsky were motivated by political ideology, but rather I'm proposing that the state censorship and policies to obliterate Ukrainian culture created an environment that allowed these works to resonate with Russian beliefs about Ukraine and Ukrainians. So in the end, we can see Makovsky's painting as the result of a long and complex process of transculturation. First, Russian artists came to terms with the conventions of the female nude that originated in Western European art world. Then they experimented with translating them into native subjects, locating them within the Russian Empire, but displacing them into Ukraine. Looking at these paintings in the way that foregrounds their Ukrainian connections seems to me to raise questions that I'm not entirely sure that I can answer right now, but I do think that it's valuable to examine Russia's history of imperial domination in all of its manifestations, how it shaped cultural production then, and how it continues to shape ideas today. Thank you. if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take questions, thoughts, ideas about anything. You want to move to?
Could you, Margaret, talk about any ways in which this work was shaped by the current situation in Ukraine? Or any connections that you see to it? The war, I'm talking about
You
the
mean
Russia-Ukraine war now.
This painting?
Yes, in any ways that your work was shaped like that, you're thinking about it might have been shaped by that, or parallels you see to what's happening?
Right, yeah. I don't know about works parallel to this being produced today, but I mean, my reason for investigating this question was started in 2022. I mean, in February 2022, like practically everybody in the field, we were just paralyzed. I mean, I studied the Russian Imperial Center. I work on artists who grew up, who were born in Ukraine and studied and worked in St. Petersburg, who were born in Russia, who were born in Poland, you know, parts of the Russian Empire, but they all gravitated to the Imperial Center to study. And so my viewpoint position was really from the Imperial Center looking out. And so when I entered this period of paralysis of, you know, what is happening and how this related to what's happening today was, you know, being connected to this period of imperial expansion, I just went back and looked at my work and thought, what am I saying about Ukraine? And what I noticed was I was just saying Ukraine, which is part of the Russian Empire. You know, they went to Ukraine, which is part of the Russian Empire. And I was just saying the same thing again and again, and it wasn't really thinking why. So this was a part of a chapter, I mean, it still is part of a chapter of a book that I just finished, manuscript that I just finished. But I had to, that question of why Ukraine came out, it was just too big for that chapter. It wasn't the question I was asking, but I wanted to explore it as a separate topic. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It was completely started in 2022. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So in folklore, there's a lot of sort of figures like this. Like I think of the Celtic and Irish folklore, and mermaids and sirens, and then obviously the Celtic. So I'm curious what you think of like why there's so many myths surrounding these water women, and are they like all connected in some way, or do they all emerge separately?
That's a good question. There are people who think that they are connected, folklorists who really specialize in this, who sometimes make connections and make distinctions. Female figures are often associated with water, and that's not, you know, different cultures have different associations with them, different reasons for the association, but it's often the water nymph is a female figure instead of sometimes like a figure from the woods, or different male, right, gnomes, for example, in, I don't know, gnomes, German or English, I don't know. But so yeah, there are certain traditionally male supernatural figures and ones that are traditionally female. And the Rusalka, they're not connected, but there are similarities with mermaids and sirens and other water nymphs. The one thing that's different is that they, in Germanic folklore, they are vengeful. So they take revenge on this man who's wronged. In Russian folklore, they're just playful. They're just having fun. They will attract someone. It could be a man or a woman, but it's most often a man. And actually, I didn't mention this. Oh, so you can see his little head. He's right here. Right? You can see his little face. No, is he here? Or maybe there are two men. No, I thought there was one. Anyhow, so yeah, so there are men there. Maybe, yeah. Anyhow, so it's hard to see so close. But so they're playful, and the men don't perceive them as dangerous. But then they keep coming back to see them, and then they drown. Mermaids are in the sea, and they attract men on ships, where sailors. They're more about sailors. So these are just in local ponds and then the countryside. Does that answer your question? Kind of, yeah. So there's similarities and differences. Anybody else? Yeah.
You mentioned there's free text. Pushkin, the focus on this?
Yes.
So,
What's the other one that I didn't
Yeah.
mention? Yes. Oh, I don't remember the title of it. It's one that doesn't have a title. It's from 1826. You can look it up. So he did one in 1819, and that's the ballad that I mentioned. He did one in 1826. It doesn't have a title, but it's something like "I strolled out on a lovely night" or something like that. And written in the first person, and it's much more sensual. Like he's experiences the Rusalka's kisses, and then he drowns. Or he's about to, yeah. So it's first person, but you should be able to find it. Yeah, and then the final one was the unfinished dramatic work from the theater, but the dramatic work was made into an opera, so it was reused.
And I think there is also famous Pushkin's Rusalka that's sitting up on the benches of the tree. It's just the Rusalka на ветвях сидит, yeah. So it's not really about Rusalka, it's the introduction to Ruslan and Lyudmila, Лукоморье, у Лукоморья дуб зеленый, and then he describes all the magic creatures, including a cat that walks around the oak tree and tells the stories. And then there is this Rusalka на ветвях сидит. And I remember myself reading this story as a child, and I thought, how can Rusalka sit on a tree? It has fishtail. Because that is sort of the typical, image of a Rusalka. It's the same as mermaid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they were. I mean, he was head of. He became half French, so we don't always entirely trust Makovsky for being faithful to Russian folklore. So. In the folklore that we read and probably that Pushkin had access to, sometimes they are not in the water, sometimes they're walking across the field, and sometimes they're up in trees. So there are different versions. They're different versions. They're usually associated with water and with happily drowning people.
I had the same association. Like I was thinking of it, and I was realizing, oh, right, I was thinking of like mermaids with other mermaids. Yeah. I never heard that show.
Margaret, do you happen to know the etymology of the word Rusalka?
I don't. No, I
Because
don't.
it sounds like it has something to do with Rus,
Yeah.
but I don't think so.
I don't think
It
so,
has to
yeah.
be something different, right?
Yeah, I haven't found that in the folklore sources that I mentioned.
Is a map based on just like literature mentions of?
So the map that I made, I don't want to flip back to it. Yes, I made that map. That was my own Google Maps with pin drops on it, and I did that based on folklore accounts. So in the 19th century and the early 20th century, a lot of folklorists were doing, interviews from eyewitnesses who saw Rusalki, and so I just located where they all were and dropped pins.
What were the other spots where they were popular, I guess?
Pardon me?
What were the other like spots where they were popular?
Where else were they cited, you mean?
Yeah, sure.
They exist in other cultures outside of Western
yes.
Russia, right? So not just Ukraine, but Bulgaria, Poland, other places. In Ukraine, they're called mavki. So they have a different name. And in Poland and Bulgaria, they have different names too. So when I gave a shorter version of this talk over the summer for a Slavic conference, there were a bunch of people from doing Polish and Bulgarian and whatever folklore, and they were saying, oh, you should look up like Polish, the version. And I'm thinking, well, oh yes, but this is not really my subject. But it is interesting. You could do a lot with the topic. It's a really fascinating subject.
So there are lots of examples, like from when I think about Russian literature. One of the stories we read in the Moscow course, it's the story by Karamzin, Бедная Лиза, Poor
Yes.
Lisa.
Yeah.
And then she is a very good, she could become a Rusalka.
Yes,
Because at the end of the story, she is abandoned by her lover,
Yeah.
who's a young nobleman, right? And there are some hints in the story, not very clear, but there are some hints that she could be pregnant. And then she drowns. She jumps into the pond on the outskirts of Moscow, and she drowns, and then we don't really know what's the story, but the image of her, the memory of her haunts poor Erast until the end of his life. He has a long life, but he suffers, and Karamzin makes sure that he does suffer every day of his life. But there is no, I mean, it's not mentioned that her image appears as a rusalka, but she could be a rusalka, right?
Yeah, I sometimes think about poor Lisa when poor Lisa, the name of this story, for the people who are not Slavists.
Yeah.
So the Biedna Lisa, poor Lisa, who drowns herself, she was absolutely seduced and betrayed, like exactly like the Pushkin's heroine. But yeah, I think she's a sentimental heroine, right? So she just drowns herself, but in the romantic version, she comes back as a rusalka, supernatural. I think that's a difference in just periods, maybe the kind of style. But yeah, she could have been a rusalka.
And it also made me think of a famous painting, I think it's Perov, Utopленница.
Yes.
I don't know what's the English for it.
Yeah, the drowned woman.
The drowned woman, right.
Yeah.
And it's a painting that shows basically fully clothed young woman, and then there is a policeman sitting right next to her, and they're both on the bank of Neva.
Yeah.
I think
it's also the Moscow River.
Or maybe it's Moscow.
Yeah. But yeah, he's the police officer. She's been found drowned in the river, and he's pulled her out. This is from the 1870s. But this is an urban story. So yeah,
there's no chance.
No chance of her being a rusalka because she's a city woman. Yeah, I mean, who knows? We don't see them in the city, they're not in the country. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
I feel like the setting of like the Kievskaya Rus is very common for like mythology and all these things that are inspired by that folklore. I wonder how common it was to like do the thing that they did with architecture, where they just like focus on that aesthetic, like of the mythology and antiquity so much that they just like overwrite the like an accurate depiction of Ukraine, I guess.
How often Russia?
Yeah, I wonder if this is like a common pattern for like, you mentioned that the artists actually had reference of like there being like different types of architecture there that is more associated with like European centric, but for the like aesthetic he wanted, I guess, he just overwrites it to be this like ancient, associated with Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting. Exactly in architecture, there is a tendency to rewrite Ukrainian history. And there are examples of Ukrainian architecture which in the, there was a whole period when Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, right? So this whole part in which it was not part of the Russian Empire, right? Part of its own thing. And its architecture became very Baroque, like very Western European. And so new things were being built then, or additions were being made on to existing medieval architecture. And when Russians from the late 1890s, early 20th century decided that it needed to be renovated, they would renovate it like something from Novgorod, which is in northern Russia, and it has nothing to do with Kiev, right? Nothing to do with that region. It was from a different period in a different region, but they imposed this Novgorod style on it because it had to look old and it had to look, in the right way. Yeah, so there are lots of examples of rewriting Ukrainian history, Ukrainian visual culture, cultural history. Those are the ones that I know of.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. It's been, again, such a treat to be back here in Congress. Wonderful to see people again. And, yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Margaret. I think that was wonderful.